The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. From Part 1, A Pocket Full of Magic. The frame story of 1001 Nights. Since the stories of the two Sinbads are part of such a long cycle of fairy tales, the final resolution, or integration, occurs only at the very end of the Arabian Nights entertainments. Therefore, we must now consider the frame story which introduces and ends the entire cycle. King Shahryar is deeply disillusioned with women and a viciously angry man because he has found out that not only has his wife betrayed him with his black slaves, but that the same thing has happened to his brother, King Shahzaman, and, further, that even a most powerful and cunning genie is continually betrayed by a woman he believes to be most carefully locked up. King Shahryar has had his eyes opened to his wife's betrayal by his brother, King Shahzaman. About the latter, we are told, he could not forget the perfidy of his wife, and grief grew on him more and more, and his color changed and his body became weak. When questioned by King Shahryar about the reasons for his decline, King Shahzaman answers, "Oh, my brother, I have an internal wound." Since his brother seems to be a double for King Shahryar, we can assume that he also suffers terribly from an internal wound, the belief that nobody could truly love him. King Shahryar, having lost all trust in mankind, decides that henceforth he will give no woman a chance to betray him ever again, and that he will live a life of lust only. From then on, he sleeps each night with a virgin, who is killed the following morning. Finally, no nubile virgin is left in his kingdom but Scheherazade, the daughter of the king's vizier. The vizier has no intention of sacrificing his daughter, but she insists that she wishes to become the means of deliverance. She accomplishes this by telling each knight for 1,000 nights a story which so enthralls the king that he does not have her killed because he wishes to hear the story's continuation on the following night. Delivery from death through the telling of fairy tales is a motif which starts the cycle. It also reappears throughout the cycle and ends it. For example, in the very first of the 1001 Tales, the story of the three sheiks, a genie threatens to destroy a merchant but is so taken by the merchant's story that he spares the merchant. At the cycle's end, the king declares his trust in and love for Scheherazade. He is cured forever of his hatred for women by Scheherazade's love, and they live happily together for the rest of their lives, or so we are given to understand. According to the frame story, two protagonists, one male and one female, meet in the great crisis of their lives. The king, disgusted with life and full of hatred of women, Scheherazade fearing for her life, but determined to achieve his and her deliverance. She attains her goal through the telling of many fairy tales. No single story can accomplish it, for our psychological problems are much too complex and difficult of solution. Only a wide variety of fairy tales could provide the impetus for such catharsis. It takes nearly 3 years of continued telling of fairy tales to free the king of his deep depression to achieve his cure. It requires his attentive listening to fairy tales for 1,000 nights to reintegrate his completely disintegrated personality. Here, it should be recalled that in Hindu medicine and the 1001 Nights cycle is of Indian-Persian origin. The mentally deranged person is told a fairy story, contemplation of which will help him overcome his emotional disturbance. Fairy tales have meaning on many different levels. On another level of meaning, the two protagonists in this story stand for the warring tendencies within us which, if we fail to integrate them, will surely destroy us. The king symbolizes a person completely dominated by his id because his ego, due to severe disappointments in life, has lost its strength to keep his id in bounds. After all, the task of the ego is to protect us against devastating deprivation, which in the story is symbolized by the king's being sexually betrayed. If the ego fails to do so, it loses its power to guide our lives. The other figure of the frame story, Scheherazade, represents the ego, as is clearly suggested by our being told that she had collected 1,000 books of chronicles of past peoples and bygone poets. Moreover, she had read books of science and medicine. Her memory was stored with verses and stories and folklore and the sayings of kings and sages, and she was wise, witty, and well-bred, an exhaustive enumeration of ego attributes. Thus, uncontrolled id, the king, in the long drawn-out process, becomes finally civilized through the impact of an ego incarnate. But it is an ego very much dominated by the superego, so much so that Scheherazade is determined to risk her life. She says, "Either I will be the means of the deliverance of the daughters of the Muslims from slaughter, or I will die and perish as others have perished." Her father tries to dissuade her and admonishes her, "Do not thus adventure thy life." But nothing can deter her from her purpose, as she insists, "It must be so. In Scheherazade, we thus see a superego-dominated ego which has become so cut off from selfish id that it is ready to risk the person's very existence to obey a moral obligation in the king, an id which has cut loose from ego and superego. Having such a strong ego, Scheherazade enters her moral mission with a plan. She will arrange it so that she can tell the king a story of such an intriguing nature that he will want to hear the rest of it, and for that reason will spare her life. And indeed, when the morning dawns and she interrupts her story, the king says to himself, "I will not kill her till I hear the rest of the story." But her entrancing stories, the continuation of which the king wishes to hear, postpone her death only from day to day. For the deliverance Scheherazade has made her goal, more is needed. Only a person whose ego has learned to draw on the positive energies of the id for its constructive purposes can then set the ego to control and civilize the murderous propensities of the id. Only when Scheherazade's love for the king further inspires her storytelling, that is, when superego, the wish to deliver the daughters of Muslims from slaughter, and id, her love for the king whom she now also wishes to deliver from his hatred and depression, both endow the ego, has she become a fully integrated person. Such a person, the frame story tells, is able to deliver the world from evil as she gains happiness for herself and for the dark other who believed that none was available to him. As she declares her love for the king, he declares his for her. What greater testimony can we have to the power of all fairy tales to change our personality than the ending of this one tale, the frame story of 1001 Nights? Murderous hatred has been changed into enduring love. One more element of the frame story of 1001 Nights is worth mentioning. Scheherazade from the very beginning expresses the hope that telling the fairy tales may help her to turn the king from his custom, but for this she needs the help of her little sister, Danayazad, whom she instructs what to do. "When I go up to the Sultan, I will send after thee, and when thou comest to me and seest that the king has done his will of me, do thou say to me, O my sister, and thou be not asleep, tell us some of thy delightful stories to pass away the watches of this our night." Thus, in a fashion, Scheherazade and the king are as husband and wife, and Danayazad is like their child. It is her spoken wish to hear the fairy tales which forms the first bond between the king and Scheherazade. At the cycle's end, Danayazad is replaced by a little boy, the king's and Scheherazade's son, whom she brings to the king as she declares her love for him. The integration of the king's personality is sealed by his having become the father of a family. But before we can achieve mature integration of our personalities, such as that projected in the figure of the king at the end of 1001 Nights, we have to struggle through many developmental crises, two of which, closely connected to each other, are among the most difficult to master. The first of them centers on the question of personality integration. Who am I really? Given the contradictory tendencies residing within me, which of them should I respond to? The fairy tale answer is the same one which psychoanalysis offers. To avoid being tossed about and, in extreme cases, torn apart by our ambivalences requires that we integrate them. Only in this way can we achieve a unified personality able to meet successfully with inner security the difficulties of living. Inner integration is not something that is achieved once and for all. It is a task that confronts us all our lives, although in different forms and degrees. Fairy tales do not present such integration as a lifelong endeavor. This would be too discouraging to the child, who finds it difficult to achieve even temporary integration of his ambivalences. Instead, each tale projects at its happy ending the integration of some inner conflict. Since there are innumerable fairy tales, each having some different form of basic conflict for its topic, in their combination these stories demonstrate that in life we encounter many conflicts which we must master, each at its time. The second, very difficult developmental crisis is the Oedipal conflict. It is a series of painful and confusing experiences through which the child becomes truly himself if he succeeds in separating himself from his parents. To do so, he must free himself from the power his parents have over him and, much more difficult, from the power he has given them out of his anxiety and dependency needs, and from his wish that they should forever belong only to him, as he feels he has belonged to them. Most of the fairy stories discussed in the first part of this book project the need for inner integration, while those in part 2 deal also with Oedipal problems. In considering them, we shall have moved from the most famous fairy tale cycle of the Eastern world to the germinal tragedy of Western drama and, according to Freud, of life for all of us.